There have been many times where acquisitions don't pan out in the automotive world, kind of like Ford and Jaguar. Link to that video in the comments below. But today we'll be highlighting GM acquiring Saab. Sometimes opposites attract, but not in this case. Let's dive in. In 1990, GM bought a stake in Saab, and it was good for GM. This kept pace with Ford, as GM had been in discussions with Jaguar about acquiring a minority stake until Ford came knocking and took Jaguar from the grips of GM. So GM forked out a cool $700 million to buy a 50% stake into the Swedish automaker. And on the flip side, this was good for Saab. Well, on paper at least. They would gain access to an expansive dealer network. Saab had already been stateside since 1956 with their introduction of their model, the very popular Saab 93, but now their dealership network had expanded tremendously, and production time was cut down exponentially. Saab's factory in 1989 was taking approximately 110 hours to build each car, a slow process by industry standards. GM initiated principles of modern lean manufacturing that helped to shrink the build time to a far more competitive 30 hours per car with the new 900. The first year of production under GM ownership in 1991 would see Saab produce 80,000 vehicles. In 1994, Saab would post a $77 million profit, the first time it had a profit in 7 years. Sales were up by around 21% year on year, so things looked to be on the up for the brand. But it would quickly go awry. GM would exercise its option to purchase the remaining half of Saab in January of 2000, making the Swedish automaker a wholly owned division and GM's most recognizable global brand. Work began immediately on launching the 2003 9/3 sports sedan, but quickly the two brands' philosophies would clash. GM wanted Saab to be a rebadged Opel, something they fought on until the very end. But despite protests, Saab underwent tons of changes executed by GM, many of which weakened the brand's appeal. Yeah, it's kind of like everything GM touches turns into shit. Saab, under GM guidance, found it increasingly difficult to compete in a market that favored more mainstream models. It should also be noted, in the early 2000s, consumer preferences began to shift towards these more mainstream models. Who would have thought? The public had seen Saab's cars to be quote-unquote goofy looking. Bob Lutz, mastermind behind the catastrophic Ford Merkur, I did a video on that as well. He has been quoted to say, when it was goofy, which the automotive press loved, there were only 100,000 people in the whole freaking world that wanted one. But I will say I have to give it to Saab for sticking to their guns and keeping their designs unique. You don't see that much anymore. Moving on from that, what pushed the nail further into the coffin was the 2008 financial crisis. Well, we all know what GM had to do to survive, but if you needed a refresher, definitely not because I love dragging GM whenever possible, they took out a small loan of $11.2 billion from hardworking Americans, and the government spent about $50 billion to save the company. The bailout forced GM to cut costs and focus on long-term profitability. Pontiac was the most high-profile sacrificial lamb. No one cares about you, Saturn. Go away. But Saab would soon be on the chopping block, and in 2010, GM would sell Saab to Spyker. This totally didn't go bad at all. GM would still supply Saab with parts and completed vehicles, but it wasn't enough. There was some more changing of the hands with Saab, and attempts to revive them were made, but long story short, because it's a headache, honestly, they would declare bankruptcy and officially shut the doors in 2014. And so ended one of the worst ends to such a famed brand. GM wanted another copy and paste brand, like how Pontiac unfortunately ended up, but Saab wanted to remain unique. And you could argue that GM didn't know how to manage the brand, and, well, I'd agree with that. But regardless, GM dropped the ball on Saab, which, something that describes GM for the last, 30 years? Anyway, enough GM ranting. With that, stay hydrated, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Please, for the love of God, stay away from GMs, and peace.